Welcome, everyone. We are just going to give any stragglers a few more minutes, or excuse me, a few more seconds rather, and then we will begin.
Well, welcome everyone to Jane Austen and Company. We're so happy you could join us tonight. My name is Anne Fertig, and I am a doctoral candidate at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in the Department of English and Comparative Literature, as well as the co-director of Jane Austen and Company. We are so happy tonight to welcome the 7th speaker in our Staying Home with Jane Austen series, which looks at the domestic lives and activities of women and people in Jane Austen's life and books. So welcome Susan Allen Ford, our dear friend who has come to the Jane Austen Summer Program many times. She'll be talking to us tonight about reading with Jane Austen. But first, I'd like to hand things over to my co-director, Dr. Inga Brody.
Hi, I'm Inga Brody, co-director of this lovely program with Anne Fertig, and also a director of the Jane Austen Summer Program. I teach at University of North Carolina, Department of English and Comparative Literature. And I'm delighted to have Susan Allen Ford with us today. Susan Allen Ford has been for many years a professor at Delta State University, just recently retired, and is a very well-known Austen scholar and a frequent speaker at Austen events around the world. She's the editor of the 2 main Austen journals in existence, so the, at least in English, the Persuasions and Persuasions Online. And she's a lifetime member of JASNA. She has been, I think of her as a lifetime member of JASP too. And she's been with us from the beginning, and I think will continue on with us, I hope. And Susan has been working on for a while on a book on Austen and her readers and reading in Austen. And today I think is a very welcome installment in that book project that we've all been looking forward to. You're muted, Anne.
I would also like to introduce now Emily Spera, who will be helping out tonight. She is our technical director here with Jane Austen and Company and the registrar at the Jane Austen Summer Program. Emily is going to be in charge of moderating the chat, and she's going to go over how the Q&A process will work for tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. So after we're done here with our introductions, Susan will speak to us about reading with Jane Austen for about 45 to 50 minutes. After she's done with her presentation, we will open things up for a Q&A session. Now, you probably noticed that you don't have your cameras on and you don't have the ability to turn your mic on. What you're going to do instead is use the Q&A box to ask questions to Susan. I see that so many of you have already found the chat box, and we love to see where everyone's from, so thank you for participating there. But the chat box does tend to get a little messy during our presentations, so if you have specific questions, please put them in the Q&A box. That's what we go through the Q&A portion. So if you put a question in the chat, it might be missed. After we put things in the Q&A box, excuse me, after the Q&A session, please stick around to hear about our future events with Staying Home with Jane Austen and to hear the winners of our most recent creative writing contest, Playing Games with Jane Austen.
Thank you, Emily. Please do note that tonight's program will be recorded. So if you're having internet issues or you have to leave, don't worry. We'll notify you via our Facebook page and our website when the videos are available to view. And without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Susan.
Okay, this is the tricky part. Okay. PowerPoint.
Yay.
How's that?
Perfect.
Good.
Okay, I feel like a success, no matter what else happens. So thank you, Inger, for that introduction. And I also want to thank you and Emily and Anne for inviting me to be a part of this series, which I have really loved. For about the past 30 years, I've been interested in the fact that the characters in Jane Austen's fiction read books, and often specific books. Why? How does that reading affect our sense of these characters and the novels they're in, especially if we too have read the same books that they have? What does that tactic say about how Jane Austen shapes readers' expectations, about how she creates her readers? I'm not going to talk about any of that today. A month or two into the pandemic, I decided that I should use some of the time at my disposal to back up a bit. If I was going to focus on characters as readers, I should probably think about what we know about Jane Austen as a reader. I had some general ideas, but not a lot to back those up with. So I looked at Austen's letters, which I'd been planning to do anyway for a JASP. I looked at the stories about her in family histories, and I looked at a range of material about what we know about readers and reading during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, so that I could think about how Austen fits into a larger picture. Today, I want to talk about what we know about the books she owned, the ways she had access to books, what she said about books, and how books were part of the currency of sociability in her world. Oops, wait a minute. All right, why is it not? Okay, sorry. Okay. So you've all seen this before. This is Henry Austen's biographical notice, and that's the first bit of biographical information we have. It was published with Northanger Abbey and Persuasion in 1818, the year after she died. He gives us a very general and very moral view. He also emphasizes serious writing, history, belles lettres, moral writers in prose and verse, and Richardson's novel, in which he sets out to give a portrait of a man of religion and virtue. Fielding is raised only to suggest that she recoiled from his work, and no women writers are mentioned. You won't be surprised, probably, to hear me suggest that there's a bigger picture. Quite run over with books. Like most of her family, Jane Austen was a great reader, an avid consumer and producer of a range of literary experiences. Of her surviving letters, approximately 3/4, that's 119 out of 161, I went and counted, mention or discuss reading books or newspapers, either silently or aloud, allude to or quote from literary works, discuss and analyze her theater experience, or refer to her own writing, the processes of publication, and the reception of her fiction. So what do we know of that reading experience? Despite limited financial resources, Jane Austen was not just a reader, but an owner and a chooser of books. David Gilson's bibliography identifies 20 titles with her name inscribed, which he says have a fair claim to having been Jane Austen's property. 2 others that she gave to her niece Anna seem also to have been hers first. So here are the books read as a young child or an adult by her. You'll see that there's some French here, a children's book, history, and the bottom 2 books, the Elegant Extracts and Mentoria, those are the books that she gave to her niece, and those are educational texts. Well, Elegant Extracts is also an anthology. Here's what she had of nonfiction. We have here history, devotion, essay, and travel. And here's what we have of poetry and novels. And Anne or Emily is going to send you these, so don't worry about it. Some of these were shared books from the schoolroom. Some were gifts from her uncle James Lee Parrott, whose book plate remains in them. And we know that there were others. Before the move to Bath in 1801, Jane sold some of her books as well as her music and her pianoforte. She wrote to Cassandra that her books were said to have sold well, and at least one transaction satisfied her. 10 shillings for Dodsley's poems please me to the quick, she said, and I do not care how often I sell them for as much. When Mrs. Bramston has read them through, I will sell them again. Gilson mentions also the possibility that the copy of Voltaire's The History of Charles XII, King of Sweden, which is inscribed with the initials J.A., could have been the property of either Jane or her brother James. Jane, though, mentions Charles XII in a letter to her brother Frank when he's sailing around Sweden, so she, may well have been the owner there. Olivia Murphy has speculated that many of the books listed in the south case of the library at Godmersham Park, the estate of Jane Austen's brother Edward Knight, might also have belonged to Jane and then to Cassandra, including novels by Mary Brunton, Frances Burney, Maria Edgeworth, and Harriet and Sophia Lee, as well as Walter Scott's verse romances Marmion and The Lady of the Lake. It's impossible, really, to say how many other books Austen might have accumulated either before or after the sale in 1801. Much of the reading Jane Austen did while in Steventon must have come from her father's library. Last week at the virtual AGM for JASNA, Catherine Sutherland suggested, however, that though we assume that she had access to her father's library, she would have been aware that her father's books weren't open to her in the same way that they were to the boys. Jacqueline Pearson argues that private libraries as the realm of the father were not entirely accessible to the women, and in the fiction of the period, they often are specifically figured, specifically figure patriarchal power. And further, as the conduct literature shows, women's reading was monitored. In Jane's letters of 1798, there are, however, several references to her father's book buying, as well as the indication that these are books to which she has access. On their return from a trip to Godmersham, she wrote to Cassandra, "The books from Winton are all unpacked and put away, and there's now very good room in the bookcase for all that we wish to have there." During the next month, she mentioned that her father bought Arthur Fitz-Albini, a novel, 1798, by Sir Samuel Egerton Bridges, "against my private wishes, for it does not quite satisfy my feelings that we should purchase the only one of Egerton's works of which his family are ashamed. That these scruples, however, do not at all interfere with my reading it, you will easily believe." The same letter contemplates more purchases. "We have got Boswell's Tour to the Hebrides and are to have his Life of Johnson. And as some money will yet remain in Burden's hands, it's to be laid out in the purchase of Cooper's works. Before the month elapses, her wish is granted. My father reads Cooper to us in the evening, to which I listen when I can." Irene Collins underscores the consequence, the importance of book purchases for the Austen family. Although economic pressures caused George Austen to give up his carriage that year and retrench in other ways, he continued to spend money on books, even though they'd been steadily increasing in price throughout the 18th century. In this impetus to assemble a personal library, the Reverend George Austen was part of a larger cultural trend. In 1729, in The Complete English Gentleman, Daniel Defoe offered a satiric view of gentry ignorance as one man chides another. "Oh, but sir," he says, "no gentleman is without a library. 'Tis more in fashion now than it ever was." By the late 18th century, John Brewer writes, "A house without a library was almost unthinkable. As the century progressed, also the clergy gained in social status and their houses improved. Parsonages were renovated or torn down and rebuilt into gentlemen's houses, often with a study. Collins points out that part of George Austen's renovation to the Steventon parsonage in the mid-1760s was just such an addition. And it's in one of these two little back bays coming off the house. Collins calls him unpretentious because he housed his 500 volumes, approximately 200 separate titles, in Hepplewhite bookcases, but did not follow the fashion of calling his study the library. Even before she had earned money from her writing, Jane Austen seems to have been a sometime purchaser of books. Before she was 21, she paid 1 guinea to subscribe to Camilla. In 1808, after a gift of money from Edward's adopted mother, Catherine Knight, she had her name put down as a subscriber to 2 sermons by the Reverend T. Jefferson of Tunbridge. She says, "I now have some money to spare. My last letter was closed before it occurred to me how possible, how right, and how gratifying such a measure would be." As the narrator of Mansfield Park comments, when her uncle having given her 10 pounds, Fanny Price subscribes to a circulating library, wealth is luxurious and daring. Besides the books available to Austen at home, she or her family subscribed to circulating libraries and joined at least one book society. Evidence of these subscriptions is scattered throughout the letters. And this is something I hadn't really noticed before, beginning with a 1798 letter describing her father at a coaching inn reading The Midnight Bell, which he's got from the library. Not 2 months later, she received an invitation from a woman in Basingstoke announcing her new business. "I've received a very civil note from Mrs. Martin requesting my name as a subscriber to the library, which opens the 14th of January. And my name, or rather yours," she tells Cassandra, "is accordingly given. My mother finds the money." As an inducement to subscribe, Mrs. Martin tells us that her collection is not to consist only of novels, but of every kind of literature, etc., etc. She might have spared this pretension to our family, who are great novel readers and not ashamed of being so. But it was necessary, I suppose, to the self-consequence of half her subscribers. The circulating library could be a flashpoint for fears about the connections between reading, especially novel reading, and women's loss of innocence. Richard Brinsley Sheridan's Sir Anthony Absolute famously described it as an evergreen tree of diabolical knowledge. It blossoms through the year, and depend on it, they who are so fond of handling the leaves will long for the fruit at last. The physicality of this language underscores the erotically charged anxiety. More seriously, in an inquiry into the duties of the female sex, Thomas Gisborne issued a similar warning against circulating libraries in the book club, similar even in imagery, especially for young women. The produce of the book club and the contents of the circulating library are devoured with indiscriminate and insatiable avidity. Hence, the mind is secretly corrupted. Let it be observed, too, that in exact correspondence with the increase of a passion for reading novels, an aversion to reading of a more improving nature will gather strength. Since Cassandra's name was the one given as a subscriber, with Mrs. Austen paying the fee, the Steventon family seemed unworried about such consequences. This is really not so related to the talk, but I found this image this morning. This young woman who's being monitored by the older woman in the corner looks like she's reading a book, but actually there is a letter hidden in the pages of the book. So we see where this sort of thing can lead. Though Mrs. Martin's library failed within the year, the Austens no doubt continued to subscribe to other circulating libraries. Letters from their time in Southampton mention a number of books from the circulating library. Madame de Genlis's Alphonsine, Charlotte Lennox's The Female Quixote, Isabelle de Montelu's Caroline de Lichtfield. When they lived at Chawton, their niece Anna remembers procuring novels from a circulating library at Alton. During Jane Austen's lifetime, there was a growth in reading opportunities in terms both of the numbers of texts printed and of expanded access. After the revision of the copyright laws in 1774, William St. Clair explains, there was an explosion of printed matter as old titles were published in more and cheaper editions. And at the same time, prices for the growing numbers of new titles increased. St. Clair reports that the number of circulating libraries in Britain grew between 1800 and 1821 from 1,000 to 1,500. Fiction, particularly recent fiction, made up a large portion of their stock. The mainly masculine book societies, St. Clair asserts, read the nonfiction texts of the public sphere: history, religion, political pamphlets, travel, and literature. And there is some argument among historians about the gender division of circulating libraries versus book societies, or even what percentage of circulating libraries served primarily women, or even had mainly novel stock. Robin Vick lists the 1811 subject headings of the Alton Book Society's catalog: politics, history, natural history, biography, travels, theology, poetry, plays, criticism, letters, essays, trials, and miscellaneous, whatever that is. He notes the absence of prose fiction from the collection. The Alton Book Society also made available a selection of periodicals, from the nonconformist Monthly Review to the virulently reactionary Anti-Jacobin Review, and including the Quarterly Review and the Edinburgh Review. So they really served a wide range of tastes. A varied reading experience was thus possible. The books Austen herself identified from the society to which she belongs, and I think this must be Chawton, really, give a sense of the range of subjects and genres. Sir Charles William Paisley's essay on military policy and the institutions of the British Empire, and Grant's Letters from the Mountains, which is a collection of letters, James Smith and Horatio Smith's Rejected Addresses, which is poetic parody, something by Maria Edgeworth, possibly Tales from Fashionable Life, and Letitia Matilda Hawkins' Roseanne, or A Father's Labors Lost, a novel. In the letter in which she mentions Paisley, she also mentions Clarkson and Buchanan, probably meaning Thomas Clarkson's History of the Abolition of the African Slave Trade and Claudius Buchanan's Christian Researches in Asia, likely also borrowed from a circulating library or book society. So that's Jane reading at home. But books were an important part of daily life, even when the Austens were away from home. Like Charlotte Haywood, on her arrival at Sanditon, they joined local circulating libraries when they traveled. From London, Jane wrote to Cassandra, "We have tried to get self-control, but in vain." This relatively new novel, it was published in 1810, would certainly have been available for purchase in London, but might well have been in high demand at a circulating library. In a letter to her niece, Anna, Austen remembers that the library in Dawlish was particularly pitiful and wretched 12 years ago, and not likely to have anybody's publication. To Cassandra, visiting Cheltenham, Jane remarked, "Your library will be a great resource." Books were a necessary part of daily life in any location. And of course, visiting her brother Edward Knight's family, Austen had access to the library at Godmersham Park. Jane Austen stayed at Godmersham 6 times after 1798, the year in which Edward's family moved there, totaling about 10 months. 4 of Jane Austen's letters mention the library there, particularly her enjoyment in sitting there and reading or writing. According to Mark Gerard, the country house library developed over the course of the 18th century. Its handsomely designed bookcases, he says, were likely to contain an all-around collection of several thousand books, both new and old, a good many of which were still being read by the occupants of the house. Godmersham and its library seem fairly typical. Both the house and its collection expanded over the course of the 18th century. The original house, built in 1732, was expanded with the addition of the wings that you can see here, in 1781. And for those interested in Jane Austen, the most significant aspect of the additions was the library, which I've got a red arrow at the extreme end of the east wing. Peter Saber notes that when the Godmersham Park Library catalog was undertaken in 1818, the year after Austen's death, it contained approximately 1,200 titles, many in multi-volume sets, so about 6 times the auctioneer's estimate of George Austen's library in Steventon. About 850 of these books were in English, about 150 in French, both languages read by Austen. The other 200 were chiefly in Greek or Latin. Olivia Murphy describes the collection as typical, the kind of library, she says, that Mr. Bingley could have assembled rapidly at Netherfield. The collection comprises religion, history, biography, letters, politics, travel, art, books related to farming and the law, Greek and Latin classics, poetry, drama, prose fiction, periodicals, conduct books. In letters written to Cassandra from Godmersham, Jane Austen mentions listening to her brother James read Marmion there and reports her own rereading of Self-Control. What seems, however, an unmitigated luxury of open access should probably be understood in light of Sutherland's caution about the difference in how such books would be open to female versus male members of the same family. Pearson's understanding of the library's association with patriarchal privilege is underscored by Fitzwilliam Darcy's proud statement that Pemberley's library has been the work of generations. Godmersham's library, of course, eventually passed to its heir, Edward's eldest son. And Julian Dow has shown how even books inscribed with Edward's daughter Marianne Knight's name were retained in that library even as she lost her home. In such a context, Jane Austen's giddy declaration to Cassandra as she's alone in the Godmersham library that she is mistress of all I survey is a statement transgressive but temporary. There was one more source of books. When she switched to John Murray as her publisher, he, as was the case with other publishers, lent her current titles to read when she was in London. In particular, she thanked him for Walter Scott's poem, The Field of Waterloo, Helen Maria Williams's A Narrative of the Events, which have lately taken place in France, and the quarterly review containing Scott's review of Emma. To Cassandra, she wrote, he says that any book of his will always be at my service. Such a perk was another way she stayed abreast of literary tastes. But long before her relationship with Murray, her reading was current. In the 4 extant letters from January 1809, for example, she mentions reading or contemplating reading the recently published Memoirs of an American Lady, Margiana or Widrington Tower, a newspaper, Woman or Ida of Athens, her cousin Edward Cooper's Practical and Familiar Sermons, and Hannah More's Caleb's in Search of a Wife, which she actually doesn't want to read. In other words, much of Jane Austen's life is a reading life. As she writes to Cassandra, we are quite run over with books. In thinking about that reading life, we should consider not only what she read, but how she read it. As a young reader and writer, Jane Austen left evidence of her material interaction with books in the form of writing in blank spaces and marginal commentary. On the inside of Fables Choisies, she signed her name and on the back pages wrote in a childish hand, "Mother's angry, father's gone out." And there's the, well, I'm pointing like you can see my screen, but where that arrow is the little bit, and then I've given you the inset. It's the seeds of a narrative. As Jan Fergus writes, this sentence suggests that at 8, Austen was already an observer, a slyly humorous one. She implies that her father's exit is owing to her mother's anger, or perhaps the reverse, that her mother is angry because her father has gone out. Austen famously added to the parish register of St. Nicholas Church, recording on the form for the banns of marriage a match between the splendidly named Henry Frederick Howard Fitzwilliam of London and Jane Austen of Steventon. And following that with a marriage between the same plain Jane and Edmund Arthur William Mortimer of Liverpool, witnessed by Jack Smith and Jane Smith, late Austen. As Paula Byrne notes, she's already a fiction writer of sorts. She's also a stylist. The high romance, or as Janine Barkas puts it, the glam of the bridegrooms, is punctured by the mundanity of the author's own name. Even so early, as her juvenilia also makes clear, she plays with texts. That playfulness is embedded in her reading and its connection to her own writerly pose. In the Cambridge University Press edition of Austen's Juvenilia, Peter Saber has transcribed the marginal comments in Austen's copy of Goldsmith's History of England and in her copy of Elegant Extracts in Prose, which in 1801 she gave to her 8-year-old niece, Anna. These comments, over 100 in Goldsmith, 15 in Elegant Extracts, were made most likely in 1791, Saber speculates, just before she wrote her own History of England. The comments in Elegant Extracts chiefly articulate emotional response. Against an excerpt from William Robertson's The History of Scotland on Mary Queen of Scots, she successively writes, "No, no, yes, a lie, another lie, a third," before challenging other claims with a little more specificity. The annotations in the margins of Goldsmith, perhaps because of their greater number, exhibit a greater range. As a general rule, the early comments are simple, highly colored, even emotional judgments. What a pity. Detestable monster. Sweet man. But there's also a growing authority with which she corrects Goldsmith, indicating a careful and more than emotional engagement with her reading. She copy edits. She challenges his interpretations. She imitates his sentence structure as she overturns his readings. She recognizes her kinship with Goldsmith, her fellow writer of history. "Oh," she says, "Dr. Goldsmith, thou art as partial an historian as myself." And the balance of power shifts even further as the 15-year-old shares her achieved wisdom with the historian who professes to find the behavior of the Whigs very remarkable. "My dear Dr. G, I have lived long enough in the world to know that it is always so." That sense of readerly and writerly authority persists, Probably in 1796, she pencils a sentence at the end of her own copy of Camilla that looks forward to her commanding conclusion of Lady Susan. Since this work went to the press, a circumstance of some importance to the happiness of Camilla has taken place, namely that Dr. Marchmont has at last, and then there's a blank. The remainder of this inscription has been cut off in the rebinding, but Dr. Marchmont's death is probably the end, and it supplies a more satisfactory conclusion to a novel in which that character has, as Austen points out in a letter from September of that year, kept the lovers apart for 5 volumes. Despite her obvious admiration for and absorption into Burney's novel, she confidently improves the work of the established author. Did Jane Austen stop writing in books after 1796 or 97, perhaps ceasing the habit as she put away the things of her youth? Or do we have no more marginalia? Because after 1801, when the household was disassembled, most of the books available to her were borrowed from circulating libraries or owned by other people. Whatever the cause, we lose the insight that marginalia offers into her immediate response. Her letters, however, continue to provide evidence of her lifelong engagement with her reading. Its diversity is remarkable. Conduct, sermons, travel, politics, letters, biography and history, poetry, and of course, fiction. Sometimes there are mere mentions with a token positive or negative comment. In other cases, Austen's letters reveal a more analytical interaction with books, especially in fiction, that shows the mind of the writerly reader at work. Many of these conversations about books apparently span the course of more than one letter, as in her observation on Anne Grant's memoirs of an American lady, which she says improved as we went on, but still the same faults in part recurred, whatever those were. Her third reading of Sarah Harriet Burney's Clarentine, for example, reveals how foolish it is, how full of unnatural conduct and forced difficulties without striking merit of any kind. On a second reading of Mary Brunton's Self-Control, she provided a similar judgment. My opinion is confirmed of its being an excellently meant, elegantly written work without anything of nature or probability in it. I declare, I do not know whether Laura's passage down the American River is not the most natural, possible, everyday thing she ever does. Her opinion of Letitia Matilda Hawkins's Roseanne, or Father Slaver's Lost, which she shared with Anna, was more complex, critical of the unnatural, though she admired the author's thinking on religion. I find it, much as you describe it, very good and clever, but tedious. Mrs. Hawkins' great excellence is on serious subjects. There are some very delightful conversations and reflections on religion, but on lighter topics, I think she falls into many absurdities. And as to love, her heroine has very comical feelings. There are 1,000 improbabilities in the story. Some characters are very flat and unnatural. One wonders here if part of her project was to teach Anna, the aspiring novelist, to balance a tendency toward didacticism with an attention to probabilities. Jane Austen's judgments can be severe. Language is of particular interest, especially as it intersects with narrative intent. She wittily condemned the highly colored novelistic idiom of Sidney Owenson's The Wild Irish Girl and Woman or Ida of Athens. If the warmth of her language could affect the body, it might be worth reading in this weather. Allusions to her reading pepper Jane Austen's letters. These represent a more internalized interaction with books. She made them her own. They also represent an experience of reading that she shared with her correspondents, who, as she seemed to expect, would recognize the references and the purpose behind them. Sometimes, as in her juvenilia, she bathes in the language of fiction. On a visit to London, she wrote, "Here I am once more in this scene of dissipation and vice, and I begin already to find my morals corrupted." Though she planned to return to London earlier than she expected, she was persuaded to wait until she heard from her hosts, for if the Pearsons were not at home, I should inevitably fall a sacrifice to the arts of some fat woman who would make me drunk with small beer. The world became a fictional text for her to narrate. She wrote from Steventon after her mother had kept to her room for 5 weeks. "My mother made her entree into the dressing room through crowds of admiring spectators yesterday afternoon." And that kind of play continued through her life. More frequently, the allusions are to specific texts. She quotes, misquotes, or paraphrases many writers, including Hester Lynch Piazzi, Shakespeare, James Beattie, Cooper, Pope, Catherine Ann Dorset, Burney, Hannah Cowley, and Leonora de Gallagher de Concini. In the youthful high spirits with which she wrote about Tom Lefroy, she mentioned that he's a very great admirer of Tom Jones and therefore wears the same colored clothes, I imagine, which he did when he was wounded. Does such a comparison suggest that Tom Lefroy, with whom she flirted, was something of a scamp, however good-hearted? Later that year, oops, that's my doorbell. Later that year, after she'd received and read her subscriber's copy of Camilla, she alluded to the novel 3 times in as many weeks. "Tomorrow, I shall be just like Camilla in Mr. Doobster's summer house, for my Lionel will have taken away the ladder by which I came here, or at least by which I intended to get away, and here I must stay till his return." Or, "Tell Mary Harrison I wish that whenever she's attached to a young man, some respectable Dr. Marchmont may keep them apart for 5 volumes. And more generally of a Miss Fletcher, there are 2 traits in her character which are pleasing. Namely, she admires Camilla and drinks no cream in her tea." Her excitement at this new novel, in which she could find her own name printed, Miss J. Austen, Steventon, in the list of subscribers, is palpable. That excitement also manifests itself in a playful and performative response to texts that seems directed at delighting both her correspondent and herself. With Anna, whom she was mentoring as a novelist, she entered into the fiction of Rachel Hunter's 4-volume Lady Maclaren, the Victim of Villainy, which they had laughed at together. Another time, as Austen contemplated the problem of reaching an unsympathetic reader, Mr. Blank, who'd perhaps compared Sense and Sensibility or Pride and Prejudice unfavorably to Self-Control, she was moved to parody, again for Anna's benefit. "I will redeem my credit with him by writing a close imitation of Self-Control as soon as I can. I will improve upon it. My heroine shall not merely be wafted down an American river in a boat by herself, she shall cross the Atlantic in the same way and never stop till she reaches Gravesend." All this play with books, this kind of shared delight, suggests, as all this play with books, this kind of shared delight suggests, one thing that Austen made of her reading was a connection to others. Alluding to, quoting from, playing with, doing things with books. All these were part of the currency of sociability between Jane and Cassandra, Jane and her brothers, Jane and Martha, Jane and Anna. Live in the library. As such a use of reading suggests, for Jane Austen and her contemporaries, reading was not exclusively, maybe not even predominantly, a solitary pursuit with benefits for the self alone. There were times, of course, for solitary reading, but much of the time, reading was a social activity. Reading aloud is regularly mentioned in Austen's letters and in the family narratives. In the household at Southampton, when James and Mary Austen visited the family's evening amusement, it was the Female Quixote they read. to me, a very high amusement, as I find the work quite equal to what I remember it. Mrs. Frank Austen, to whom it's new, enjoys it as one could wish. The other Mary, I believe, has little pleasure from that or any other book. With her nieces, reading aloud could take on an educational or self-improving function. Part of her Godmersham responsibilities involved having heard Lizzie, then age 7, after which she went to the library to write her own letters. On a later trip, she spent time reading with her 20-year-old niece Fanny, noting that they were to go on with modern Europe together, but hitherto have advanced only 25 pages. Something or other has always happened to delay or curtail the reading hour. These instances mark specific announcements of this activity, but quite often reading aloud is merely implied as part of the narrative of how the family spent time. Often, both silent reading and reading aloud might be one among a variety of activities within a group. When Jane wrote to Cassandra, who is away at Godmersham, that my father reads Cooper to us in the evening, to which I listen when I can, she then imagines Cassandra's circumstances. How do you spend your evenings? I guess that Elizabeth works and that you read to her and that Edward goes to sleep. These two domestic portraits show not only the contrast between the bookish Reverend Austen and his sleeping son, but also suggest what women are often doing. Listening when other domestic responsibilities don't interfere, working, that is at needlework, or reading from a book to entertain others. Social occasions might involve this kind of reading for the enjoyment of part of the assembled company. After dinner for 14, during a very pleasant day at Ash Rectory, Austen recounted there was a whist and a casino table and 6 outsiders. Rice and Lucy made love. Matthew Robinson fell asleep. James and Mrs. Augusta alternately read Dr. Jenner's pamphlet on the cowpox, and I bestowed my company by turns on all. Reading aloud was one of Jane's own talents. She was, in at least one instance, when she and her mother read the newly published Pride and Prejudice to their neighbor, Miss Benn, impatient with her mother's technique, which even temporarily affected her own judgment of the novel. I had had some fits of disgust, she writes, but I believe something must be attributed to my mother's too rapid way of getting on. And though she perfectly understands the characters herself, she cannot speak as they ought. The family histories underscore Jane Austen's excellence as a reader. Writing in 1818, her brother Henry said simply, she read aloud with very great taste and effect. Her niece Caroline remembered that Jane Austen was considered to read aloud remarkably well. I did not often hear her, but once I knew her take up a volume of Evelina and read a few pages of Mr. Smith and the Branktons, and I thought it was like a play. And the Reverend Fulwer William Fowle, a nephew of Martha Lloyd and Mary Austen, in an 1870 letter to Caroline, recalled both Jane Austen's singing and her reading. The last time I ever saw her, she was at Steventon when she was on a visit to your mother. She was a very sweet reader. She had finished the first canto of Marmion, and I was reading the second when Mr. Digweed was announced. It was like the interruption of some pleasing dream, the illusions of which suddenly vanish. Although this account is colored with romantic nostalgia, it describes a memory with lasting power. These examples capture an interesting effect of being present while someone reads aloud. The experience might well condition and inform one's possession of the text, tying it to a specific voice, a location, or a collection of listeners. As today, hearing an old song on a car radio might conjure up other moments, other landscapes. To slip into a speculation about the afterlives of Austen's characters, who can doubt that the Bennet family would never think of Fordyce's sermons without recalling Mr. Collins's reading. As the wealth of instances suggests, reading aloud was a significant feature of the culture in which Jane Austen came of age. As Abigail Williams calls it, a near obsession. The elocutionary movement, beginning around the 1760s, prepared men in particular for public speaking and reading, especially with the law and the church in mind. But its influence spread also into the domestic sphere. To take only one example, Thomas Sheridan's Lectures on the Art of Reading, 1775, directs one preface to the clergy and another to all masters and mistresses of academies and boarding schools, focusing on how to read the divine service, how to read prose, how to read poetry. There are, however, implicit dangers for women's reading aloud, dangers allied to its function. James Fordyce of the sermons tells young women that their business chiefly is to read men, but allows that reading aloud is a safer entertainment than gaming, endless visitings, and other follies. He sees it as a valuable and pleasing accomplishment. Women, he claims, possess a heightened ability to read well, owing to that fine feeling of nature and of sentiment, which may be supposed to result from the delicacy of their organs. But reading aloud, he says, should be practiced in the frequent hearing and under the kind animadversion of an experienced judge. And he warns against reciting verse in any company that is not very private and chosen indeed. And I don't think this is the kind of company he has in mind. I found this image this morning, and the British Museum says, woman holding book, man holding woman. Okay. Mary Wollstonecraft, in her 1789 preface to the Female Reader, also sees reading aloud in terms of domestic accomplishment. Females are not educated to become public speakers or players, yet to be able to read with propriety is certainly a very desirable attainment. And Thomas Gisborne cautions that both private and public reading should be governed by modesty. Let whatever she peruses in her most private hours be such as she needs not be ashamed of reading aloud to those whose opinion she is most anxious to deserve. In other words, though reading aloud may be one of the accomplishments that constitute the attractions of a potential mate, as words on the page are delivered to the ears of listeners through the male or female body, that very physicality demands close monitoring. Reading aloud is licensed for women, but the possibility of giving license to the passions is a danger. In the Austen circle, however, both women and men read aloud, presumably in a wide range of modes and with a variety of purposes. And as the letters and family narratives indicate, read aloud in the same company. Though allowing solitary reading, the domestic library in this period, unlike the earlier study reserved for the man of the house, was set up for sociable reading as well as other forms of sociability. James Raven describes the library by the later part of the century as a parade room, a literary browsing room with corners to read in, hearths to read by, steps leading to books, desks to sit at, spaces in which to pause and discuss, a place for the communal performative reading of plays, novels, and other texts, a trend that's reflected in the number of articles in magazines and reviews about such reading. The library at Godmersham, with the 5 tables, 8 and 20 chairs, and 2 fires that Jane Austen counted for Cassandra, reflected this sociable intent. As she wrote earlier in that visit, we live in the library, except at meals, and have a fire every evening. Not every house, of course, had a designated library. The drawing room or living room might function as a central room of the modern dwelling more humble than Godmersham, again, accommodating more activities than reading. Illustrations in Humphrey Repton's Fragment of the Theory of the Practice of Landscape Gardening, 1816, show the outmoded cedar parlor, like what Sir Charles Grandison would have had, and the newer, more relaxed space, indicating the variety of pastimes it might host. And here you see conversation, people reading what looks like a newspaper or discussing it together, a woman with a harp, a child and two women with a folio, and a man reading by himself. This portrait of the space recalls Austen's own description of evenings at Ash Rectory and elsewhere. But books and the activities associated with them migrated into other rooms than those central spaces of resort for both solitary and social reading. Amanda Vickery notes that furniture makers like Chippendale and Sheraton began to market bookcases and desks designed for women as well as men. In Austen's novels, characters mainly read in libraries or drawing rooms, but some reading, for example, in Northanger Abbey or Mansfield Park, takes place in closets, dressing rooms, or bedrooms. At the Steventon Parsonage in 1798, after the Austen sons and the Reverend Austen's pupils had left, Cassandra and Jane took over an unused room as a dressing room. Anna Lefroy recalls its shelves for books, my Aunt Jane's pianoforte, and above all, on a table between the windows above which there hung a looking glass, 2 Tunbridge ware work boxes of oval shape. But the charm of the room, with its scanty furniture and cheaply papered walls, must have been, for those old enough to understand it, the flow of native homebred wit. Here too, in all probability, were first read, if not first written, Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. This space to which the girls can withdraw accommodates individual endeavors as well as shared pastimes, especially writing, reading, and the needlework that might accompany the latter. There were, of course, more public forms of sociability centered on books and reading. Prints of circulating libraries show them as places for meeting and for conversation, the purchase of books being only one among the services offered. Book societies, too, like the one to which Austen belonged in Chawton, defined a community of readers. In January and early February 1813, the very time when the newly published Pride and Prejudice was being read aloud in Chawton, other books were making their way around the community. Jane Austen recounts passing along books to other readers for a fortnight when she doesn't yet have time to read them, remarking that Chawton has many readers, or, she adds, retainers of books. You'd take these books for a 2-week period. And Chawton provides an environment for discussion, even the simple passing of books from one household to another. Upon Mrs. Digweed's mentioning that she'd sent the rejected addresses to Mr. Hinton, I began talking to her a little bit about them and expressed my hope of their having amused her. Her answer was, "Oh dear, yes, very much, very droll indeed. The opening of the house and the striking up of the fiddles." What she meant, poor woman, who shall say? I sought no farther. The Papillons have now got the book and like it very much. Their niece Eleanor has recommended it most warmly to them. She looks like a rejected address. Although Chawton does not seem to be the kind of hyperliterate society that Deborah Kaplan has defined around Steventon, and although conversations about books with Cassandra might be more substantial than these reports, we see Austen here as part of a reading community in which conversation and community spread beyond the bounds of Chawton to Steventon, where Cassandra is visiting, and London, where the Papillon's niece, Eleanor Jackson, lived. And in fact, Eleanor Jackson married Henry Austen in 1820. So, why is all this important? I'm trying to get a sense of Austen's own experience of being a reader to understand how she imagines readers in her novels and readers of her novels. And what I've learned so far is that the private and social, freedom and limitation, gravity and playfulness continually operate and sort of butt up against each other. It probably needs no ghost come from the grave to tell us this. But the details are useful, I think, to construct a sharper image of the world from which and to which Jane Austen wrote her novels. Novels that, I would argue, make us a part, along with herself and with her characters, of a community of great readers. That's it. Now what do I do?
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was so interesting. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you. Can I say one more thing before
Of course.
before the questions? I need to say how much we know, and I was really struck by this as I was working about Austen and reading and books, and everything about Jane Austen's world is dependent on the amazing scholarship of the late Deirdre LaFay. I mean, I have been deep diving into not only the addition of her letters, but the chronology, the family record, and then this amazing range of articles and books that she's written as well. And, you know, I just, this project really helped me see what I sort of knew in a much more palpable and visceral way. That's it.
Well, thank you so much. We would like to remind everyone in the audience that you can continue to drop questions in the Q&A box, and we will ask Susan to answer the questions that you guys have all sent us. And so far, a lot of our questions center on the process of the subscription libraries. I was wondering if you could clarify, do you have to subscribe to a particular book instead of the library? And if so, do you just go to get to read that book and return it? How does that work back in that time?
So you join, and it might be like £2 a year or something like that. And then you get to choose 1 or 2 volumes, depending on the rules, at a time. Now you can do this, like if you're in Bath and you go to a circulating library in Bath, you can do it in person, or you can do it, you know, by mail or, you know, some kind of other conveyance. You get those for a period usually of 2 weeks. And then when you're done, you send them back and you can get 2 more or whatever the number is. So that's kind of how it works. So it is a very good deal because you've got this amazing stock of things that you have access to, lots of contemporary current stuff, which is what I think we see with Austen's use of it in particular, as well as some, you know, classics like the Female Quixote or something like that. But a lot of really current work. So, you know, and you couldn't afford, well, she couldn't afford, and most people couldn't afford, especially with the price of new books up, to, you know, buy a lot of new titles on their own.
Great. So we have some questions about what other kinds of things are available at the circulating library, such as prints or music. Can you clarify that a little bit?
I think that's true. And again, this sort of depends on your library, but if we look at Sanditon, again, as a model, that's a small enough place that the circulating library is housed in a place that also sells baubles of some sort. And I think in, I can't remember which Burney novel it is right now, but in one of Burney's novels too, the heroine goes to the circulating library and starts to look at all these little trinkets. So I think that's pretty typical. In fact, you might be able to tell that in that image from Margate. I'm not sure.
So the music and prints would be for sale rather than for rent.
I think you could borrow those, if I'm not mistaken. You know, don't take that to the bank, but I think they were borrowable.
So you had that great quote about hearing Jane read was almost like hearing a play. We have a question about this idea of acting within the family setting. Would it have been shocking to act in an informal play within the same sort of reading setting within the family? Or is that considered to be very similar to reading a book aloud?
I think that is kind of, it's a little complicated, but on the one hand, there are lots, I mean, when people talk about reading aloud in this period, they're talking about sometimes reading a play, sometimes reading, you know, like they'll just dip into a novel. And so the kind of 18th century novel that has a lot of, you know, little inset narratives, those are really, you know, valuable for the reading aloud. You can dip in and out of those, and somebody, you know, the assembled company is not tied to plot. But yeah, so reading aloud in the living room or drawing room, a play would be fine. But that's a little different from acting. On the other hand, Jane Austen's family put on plays during her youth. You know, and Eliza de Feuillade came to visit, and you know, they produced a play. And in the sale bill for the Steventon auction in 1801, when they were breaking everything up, one of the things that's mentioned is theatrical scenery. So, you know, they did it up, you know. So I think depending on your social circumstance, maybe on your family situation, that would be more or less permissible. And certainly during the period, there were a lot of private theatricals. So,
Susan, I don't think we quite finished that question about the difference between a circulating library, subscribing to a library and subscribing to a particular edition or volume, as Austen did to Camilla.
I didn't get that. Okay, so yeah, I think when you're subscribing to a book, like you subscribe to Camilla, what you're doing is saying to Frances Burney, yes, I really want this to be a success. I'm going to get behind you. And Burney had friends and family collecting people to subscribe for her. So she wasn't really dependent on sales. I mean, that would come in too later. But that book would pretty much, I think, pay for itself or more before you know, it even hit the streets. Jocelyn Harris has an interesting essay on Persuasions Online several years ago, where she looks at the subscription list to Camilla and talks about the connections between Burney subscribers and the Austen circle. But anyway, your name would appear in the book, and then you would get to keep the book, right? And you got a real early copy. You know, that came out like July 12th. So you'd be right on there before it hit the streets. You know, it's probably more expensive than just buying a copy later, since your name is going to appear.
So it's very much like today's Kickstarter.
Right.
Campaigns.
And that other book that she subscribed to, the sermons of Mr. Jefferson, he was in a situation, I think if I'm remembering correctly, his wife had died and he had a bunch of kids. So, you know, this idea of publishing and subscribing to his sermons was a way of giving support, financial support to that family.
So the money would go to the family, not the press or the publisher, I mean.
Yeah, I guess. That's my understanding anyway. He might have had to pay the press something.
So Since so many newly published books were enclosed by rough boards, would a London library have the books bound? And additionally, do we know if Austen's own books were bound in calf or pasteboard?
I don't know that. I think my assumption is that the binding is dependent on the purchaser, not so much from the circulating library, but they must have bound somehow. But I can't imagine they had expensive bindings, you know, because one of the problems people have had tracing a lot of stock from the circulating libraries is that those books were so heavily read that they didn't really stand up, you know, for 100 or 200 years. But I assume they weren't just, maybe they were just boards. I really don't know about that.
So a question about which of Jane Austen's favorite novels would you recommend for our leisure reading?
Oh gosh. What a hard question. Yeah. That would be good. I mean, I am kind of intrigued by Edgeworth, and she's going there. I downloaded a copy of Margiana because she said, you know, we're in Margiana and I really like it, and it's some kind of Gothic thing. The Midnight Bell that her father is reading, you know, that's one that's actually really pretty good, and it gets mentioned again in Northanger Abbey. So, and you can get a modern edition of that. So that would be a fun one to read.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question, but I don't really have a good answer.
I'll throw my vote in for Edgeworth. I'm a big fan of Maria Edgeworth. And we also, of course, have the Female Quixote, which has a lot of similar themes to Northanger Abbey.
And she loves that book. You know, I mean,
yeah.
She mentions it, I think, a couple of times.
Yeah.
It stands up in ways that some of the other books, you know, don't.
So would the Austen family have been considered progressive in promoting the practice of women reading aloud to a mixed male-female gathering?
I don't think necessarily so. I also, and this is a question I have rather than an answer, I wonder how too that might have changed from, you know, say the 1790s to the 18 teens, when the kind of restrictions on women seem to get harsher. So, I mean, if you think about the way in which the niece Fanny Knight later in her life talks about how the Jane and Cassandra were not as refined as we are, you know, and it was being at Godmersham that really helped them. I wonder, you know, to what extent that's just her, you know, aging, and to what extent that suggests that certain things that were okay in the 90s were not so much okay later on. And it's a question I don't know. I mean, it's also true that Jane Austen herself felt that. She went somewhere and her mother and the woman who was there, the older woman, was darning stockings in the parlor while they were having a visit. And she says to Cassandra, "Don't mention this to our mother, lest you take that as permission." You know, so they also had this feeling that they were, you know, a little more refined than their mother. So some of that, you know, might be shifty, but I don't know.
A couple of questions from the audience are about the things that the Austens may have read aloud. One person asks whether they read the Bible, portions of the Bible aloud, and another, if you could give some of the names of plays that might have been performed, actually, so not reading, but actually performing in a household at that time.
You know, interestingly, there is never a mention of the Bible in her letters. I'm pretty sure that's true. There might be an allusion to a verse once, but I can't even think of one. So I don't know. The things that they seem to be reading are out loud or novels and poems and some essays. You know, I mean, it's that kind of biographies, that sort of thing. And what was the other part of the question? Oh,
what kind of plays might have been performed, or some titles other than Lovely Spouse?
I don't remember this for sure, but I think one of the plays that they might have done was The Wonder, or A Woman Keeps a Secret, something like that. I think there are 2 or 3 that we know about, and I just can't remember what they are. So I don't know. I think it just depend what you have. She doesn't, that I can remember, have any descriptions of reading aloud a play in the letters that we have.
I just looked in the letters and there's no Bible, or doesn't even appear in the index.
Okay.
Do we know if Jane had any subscribers for her own novels?
I don't think she went that route. You know, I think, and I don't know if you'd need to be more famous, or you'd need to have a kind of fan base already available, or relatives and friends who were willing to do it, you know, for you. And since she was keeping the secret for much of the time, she couldn't really, you know, ask for subscribers. So no, I just don't believe it probably came up ever.
The Hall's Library, this is kind of off the wall, but Hall's Library picture of Margate that you showed has had some dogs in the illustration. Do you have?
There are always dogs in the illustrations. I mean, maybe dogs were just allowed to go anywhere they wanted. I mean, I think that's very funny. Or maybe it's like the residual effects of Hogarth's illustration.
Right.
Yeah.
Animate the image, or they were very literary dogs at the time.
Maybe so. I've read the dogs before, so that may be.
So you had so many wonderful references to conduct manuals and kind of all of the dangers and rules around women reading. Were there similar prescriptions for men, or did they just kind of get to read whatever they wanted?
Yeah, they get to read what they want. I mean, I should not say that before I check more closely, but you know, their conduct manuals are about different things. It's reading in women. I mean, it's just this private activity is very dangerous. So Hester Chapone, Letters on the Improvement of the Mind, is pretty unusual in focusing her whole thing pretty much on reading in women, because what she's about is developing the mind, you know, improving the mind, and she's doing that through reading. But she starts off with, you know, things like the Bible, and she's got a very specific way of approaching it, and you know, and then she moves on to other kinds of books and other genres, and she gets to novels way at the end, and she's pretty cautious, really, about how she, you know, tells you what you should be, or how she lets you know what are good things or not good things to read. But no, man, I mean, they can run wild. I mean, Fordyce even addresses his conduct book. It's sermons to young women. It's addresses to young men, because he says, young men don't like to be preached to.
So first I should correct what I said. I was looking at the general index rather than the subject index, and there are about 10 references to the Bible or prayer book references. So Deb Barnum, thank you for that correction. So one of our audience is asking about what you just mentioned, Fordyce, and just how common would it have been to read Fordyce aloud, and is there any sense of how many people would have seen the humor in it?
You mean the humor in Jane Austen's use of it?
Mean like poking fun at Fordyce versus taking him straight.
Well, I mean, there are there's at least one Fordyce parody out there that I remember finding. And Mary Wollstonecraft spends a lot of time on Fordyce. And I'm not going to be able to remember the exact title, but Fordyce comes right after Rousseau in terms of writers who've treated women with something bordering on contempt. And she spends a lot of time just kind of taking Fordyce apart. So, although he's like the second or third biggest selling conduct book of the age. So, definitely people are reading him and are reading him, with seriousness and admiration. And then there are other, and in fact, that's what, Wollstonecraft says, this isn't even worth talking about, except that so many people, spend their time reading Fordyce. And she says, nay, girls are made to read him in school. So there is this kind of, there's a big group out there of people who are being shaped by his way of thinking about women.
We have time for one more question. Do we have any evidence or records, since we talked about her probably not having subscribers, but do we have any evidence that she was circulated in any libraries, either in the libraries themselves or her letters?
Well, it's a good question. I think we do, and I can't call it up. But one thing she does say in a letter is that more people are wanting to borrow than are willing to buy, which I cannot wonder at. And so that to me suggests that, a library may have purchased, or maybe more than one library purchased her books. But that's something I should look up because it's a great question.
Thank you so much again, Susan, for joining us tonight. This was a fascinating talk, and I think we all have new reading lists to carry us through the rest of the year.
And we're all excited to read the book too.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, gotta write it.
Before we leave tonight, we would love to invite everyone in the audience to our next event in the Staying Home with Jane Austen series. Gardening with Jane Austen, featuring Kim Wilson, will take place on November 5th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be talking about gardens and growing and outside spaces in the Regency period. And once again, it's a free program that takes place on Zoom. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and watch your emails, as we will be announcing more events soon to finish up the year with Jane Austen and Company. If you would like to sign up for this or future events, you can go to our website, www.janeaustenandco.org. This is the same place where all of our videos will be published following the talk. So if you can't make them, no worries, we do record all of them.
And those of you who attended our previous talk, Gaming with Jane Austen, likely heard about our creative writing contest. And today I would like to announce our winners of that contest. So our grand prize winner is Margaret Cheney for her short story, Whist and Wandering Thoughts. Now, Margaret's name might be familiar to you because she also was a prize winner in our Dressing with Jane Austen contest. So we were really happy to read another example of Margaret's fantastic work. Our first place winner in the adult category is Leslie Hawley for Lucy Steele's Diary. So we'll be posting both of these stories up on our website soon. And we thank everyone who participated. It was such a delight to read their work. Now, if you've been enjoying our series and Susan's talk tonight and some of our previous talks in the past, we invite you all to check out the Jane Austen summer program. So the Jane Austen summer program is kind of the head program out of which Jane Austen and Company blossomed. And it is a summer symposium that takes place over a long weekend in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, every June. We have lectures, hands-on workshops, small group discussions, a Regency ball, and other activities that blend scholarship and fandom. If you'd like to learn more and potentially think about coming to join us in Chapel Hill next summer, please check out janeaustensummer.org. And you can see that URL right there. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and thank you to all the 150 or so people who joined us today from as far away as Adelaide and Melbourne, Australia. If you enjoyed tonight's programming, please consider making a donation to the Jane Austen Summer Program. Excuse me. There'll be links in our follow-up emails. We're proud of being able to offer all these events for free, but we can't do it without support. We are a registered nonprofit, so your donations are tax deductible in the US. They help keep these events free and open to the public and allow us to bring in great speakers like Susan and our next speakers, but they also support our other activities like our student essay contests, our creative writing contests, and our annual teacher scholarships, which enable middle and high school teachers to come without any charge to our Jane Austen Summer Program. Thank you all, and thank you so much, Susan, for being here. It was a wonderful talk. It was great to see you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Susan.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.